I'm especially pleased about this afternoon's debate, which somehow has become the least controversial event we're doing all semester. This is the one that was supposed to. I know this is the one that was supposed to stir up controversy. We have a fantastic program for you this afternoon. Just a couple of announcements, and then I'll explain the format, and then I'll ask one of our students to come up and do the introductions. There's Miss Rachel, who's in the back. It's her job to clean up after all of us, and I want us to help her as much as we can. So first of all, thank you for all your work. I know some of you will have to, we'll end at around 2 o'clock, maybe a few minutes before, perhaps a few minutes after. I know some of you will have class at 2 if you need to leave. That's fine, just excuse yourself when you need to leave. I want to thank my class once again for sharing your class with the rest of the campus community. I very much appreciate it, and all of Notre Dame appreciates it. So thank you very much, class. The Constitutional Studies program and Tocqueville program, we have student fellows, our Tocqueville fellows. The fellows help us plan events. They come up with their own events. They dine with our speakers. We had a lovely breakfast with Dr. Reno this morning. If you're interested in applying for the Tocqueville Fellowship, please come talk to me, and we'll have a notice up on the website very soon if it's not there already. We have information on the Constitutional Studies minor back by the table by the food. If you're interested in the minor, please come talk to me. We have lots of minors in the room. Pick up some information as well. The format for today's event is it's a Lincoln Douglas style debate. Dr. Casarella is going to speak first for 15 minutes. Dr. Reno will speak for 20 minutes, and then Dr. Casarella will have 5 minutes. And then we'll open it up to you. As always, we'll give priority to student questions. We always like an undergraduate student to ask the first question. When you ask a question, if you could stand up, it's a large room, and tell us your name and where you are at Notre Dame. I'm going to ask Soren Hansen, a sophomore PLS and Constitutional Studies minor, to come to the podium, and she'll introduce our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Munoz, and welcome, everyone. To begin, Professor Peter Casarella has been a Notre Dame professor of theology since 2013. Before coming to Notre Dame, he served as professor of Catholic Studies at DePaul University, where he was also the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. He has previously taught at the University of Dallas and the Catholic University of America. He received his PhD in religious studies at Yale and his bachelor's degree at Yale as well. He specializes in medieval philosophy, especially Christian Neoplatonism, aesthetics, and contemporary theology surrounding the Hispanic presence in the church. His publications include Jesus Christ, the New Face of Social Progress, El Cuerpo de Cristo, the Hispanic Presence in the U.S. Catholic Church, and A World for All, Global Civil Society in Political Theory, and Trinitarian Theology. Fun fact about Professor Casarella, he lived in a bunk bed built by our next speaker when they were roommates together in graduate school. So our next speaker is Rusty Reno, and he's the editor of First Things magazine. He received his bachelor's from Haverford and his doctorate in religious ethics from Yale University. He was formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University, and he is the author of several books, including Resurrecting the Idea of Christian Society, Fighting the Noonday Devil, and other essays, personal and theological, and In the Ruins of the Church. He has also co-authored 2 books, Heroism and the Christian Life, and Sanctified Vision, an introduction to the early Christian interpretation of the Bible. His scholarly work ranges widely in systematic and moral theology, as well as in controverted questions of biblical interpretation. He has a wife and 2 children, and in his free time pursues his passion for the outdoors through rock climbing. So without further ado, Professor Casarella.
Thank you, Soren. That very kind, very revealing introduction. So I first met Rusty Reno in 1984 when I was an undergraduate at Yale. First Things had not produced its first issue yet. Rusty's always been ready to debate, and thus it seems quite natural for him to be here today. Makes perfect sense. As for my participation, however, I'm going to count it among the ironies of history. In fact, if you had said to me in 1984 that some 30 years later we would be engaged in a debate together with the phrase politics in the age of Trump in the title, I would have said you're on drugs or something like that. So neither immigration policy nor Catholic social teaching appear out of thin air. Let me begin with two anecdotes to illustrate the point. The first concerns Entidhar Aboud, an Iraqi grandmother with a serious heart condition living in Jordan and needing urgent care. Her husband, 2 daughters, and multiple grandchildren resettled a year ago in South Bend, and the children are thriving in the public schools. Under the original travel ban, she was not allowed to seek refuge here, even though she was subjected to extreme vetting by the U.S. Embassy in Jordan numerous times. Mike Griffin of Holy Cross College set up a meeting with Congresswoman Walorski's office to lobby for a change in the policy. Bishop Kevin Rhodes was ready to intervene on her behalf before the ban was changed so as not to include Iraqis. The travel ban policy, in my opinion, is still flawed, but the experience forced me to put a face on the question of immigration policy today. The second story concerns the relevance of the discourse of human rights in the church and in the world today. A friend of mine, Dr. Joe Bafil, introduced me last semester to Rosa Maria Paya, the daughter of Cuban human rights activist Osvaldo Paya. He was a Catholic dissident in Cuba who, in 2012, died under mysterious and still unexplained circumstances. Rosa Maria maintains Cuban citizenship but spends a good deal of her time in Miami with her mother. Rosa Maria was called a mercenary by the Cuban delegate at the United Nations Human Rights Council when she tried to introduce the investigation of the death of her father into the council's proceedings. She currently works for human rights in Cuba to continue the legacy of her father and his Cerella project. More about that later on. But the Cerella project itself included the accumulations of tens of thousands of signatures by her father to call for free elections in Cuba. So for me, thinking about Rosa Maria puts a human face on the Catholic human rights discourse that still needs to be fostered today. So Entidhar and Rosa Maria are two specific cases. The principles of Catholic social teaching that led Mike Griffin, myself, and Bishop Rhodes to lobby for a more humane immigration policy apply, obviously, to countless other migrants, including those still affected by the travel ban. The natural right to migrate and the right to challenge an unjust regime in an international forum are social virtues that the Church needs to promote vigorously, even when these virtuous actions may be in conflict with claims to national sovereignty. National sovereignty is also a good, but certainly not an absolute one when examined from the perspective of modern Catholic social teaching on the common good. How should Catholic social thought inform America's immigration policy? There are clearly enumerated principles, biblical principles, as well as principles that derive from the natural moral law. Both sets of principles can be applied to the public square, as many Catholic bishops have done of late. So starting with the biblical principles. Scripture is the soul of theology and a very good source for thinking in normative terms about the migrant. In the light of Scripture, the migrant is not merely a social problem that needs to be solved. The migrant's a neighbor. The biblical narrative thus contains an ethic of hospitality that applies to our times. Even in the harsh stories of migration, God is present, revealing himself, write the U.S. and Mexican Catholic bishops in their 2003 statement, Strangers No Longer. Abraham and his wife Sarah showed hospitality to 3 strangers who were actually a manifestation of the Lord. And this model of entertaining angels became a paradigm for the descendants of Abraham. God's presence to the migrant is also manifest when the children of Jacob are forced to flee Egypt. Joseph is sold into slavery and eventually becomes the Christ figure who represents the salvation of his family. The idea of building a nation of Israel is tempered by this covenantally inspired but still quasi-universalist ethic. Herein we also see a recapitulation of the entire gospel, the story of how the family of humanity can be rescued by the migrant. In the Old Testament, the Lord and liberator of Israel issued commandments regarding strangers. Exodus 23:9, you shall not oppress a resident alien. You well know how it feels to be an alien. since you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt. Israel is challenged to befriend the alien out of obedience to and in imitation of God. Their former condition as slaves in Egypt should make them more ready to offer hospitality. Even the gleaning and tithing laws of the Bible commend the welcome and the care of the alien. The history of hospitality in the New Testament begins with the refugee status of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Christian migrants and refugees can draw hope and courage from the example of the Holy Family. Matthew speaks of a presence of Jesus and migrants who frequently lack food and drink and are detained in prison. When Jesus says in Matthew 25 that whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me, the migrants are among the blessed ones of the Lord. The disciples of Christ are commanded after his resurrection to preach the gospel to all nations and to gather people from all nations to the baptismal faith. Baptism is presented here as a bond that is stronger and more fundamental than belonging to the nation, than having the same passport. These scriptural teachings have been, over time, incorporated into the magisterium of the Church. Pius XII's Exsul Familia, 1952, is considered the Magna Carta of the modern Catholic Church's thought on migration. The Second Vatican Council's Gaudium et Spes reaffirmed the right to emigrate, the dignity of migrants, the need to overcome inequalities in economic and social development, and the requirement to provide an answer to the authentic needs of human persons. These statements were frequently reiterated by Popes Paul VI and St. John Paul II, especially in their messages of World Days of Migrants and Refugees. In 2004, the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Care of Migrants and Itinerant Peoples promulgated the Love of Christ for Migrants, a charter which provided a comprehensive teaching on the Church's solidarity with the migrant and the refugee. When Pope Francis made his signature visit on July 8, 2013 to Lampedusa, a Mediterranean island pit stop of African refugees on their way to Europe, he advocated in this tradition with renewed prophetic vigor. The Argentine Pope has said quite forcefully that we're all migrants, but he's also a realist. He also warned in a recent trip to Sweden against the ghettoization of migrants, recognizing that there are limits to the number of non-asylum-seeking migrants that can be integrated into any one country. So we must seek to apply the principles contained within biblical ethics and within Catholic social teaching to the immigration debate. None of the biblical exhortations that I just cited ignores the right to national sovereignty or the prerogative of each nation to formulate policies in accord with its own needs. How then does the magisterium of the Church reconcile its strong sense of solidarity with all migrants with the admission of national sovereignty? Strangers No Longer offers this summary, 5 points. First, persons have the right to find opportunities in their homeland. Second, persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. Third, sovereign nations have the right to control their borders. Fourth, refugees and asylum seekers should be afforded protection. And fifth, the dignity and human rights of undocumented migrants should be respected. So at its core, we're told that faith in the presence of Christ in the migrant leads to a conversion of mind and heart, which leads to a renewed spirit of communion and to the building of structures of solidarity to accompany the migrant. Divine revelation and the teaching authority of the Church thus make it necessary to establish structures of solidarity with the migrant, including with the undocumented. We're called to respond to the migrant and recognize the dignity of the migrant on the basis of the trace of holiness that is accorded to the migrant by God. Individual offers of charity can represent a genuinely Christian attitude, and that needs to be taken very seriously. But by themselves, they do not go far enough. There are also social virtues that need to be affirmed. The dignity and rights of the most vulnerable of the migrants must be a concern of all persons in the Church, and the Church must witness to these social values in its teaching, preaching, and pastoral practice. Now, I turn now to the second part of this introduction. With regard to the principles drawn from natural moral law, or common morality, if you prefer, I want to start with the golden rule. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this, first things, has certainly led the way in questioning the relativism in today's secular cosmopolitanism. I'm in complete agreement with this critique. Without a normative framework oriented to the common good, the golden rule can easily degenerate into a pallid universal ethics with little content or fixed meaning. So how can we reclaim the golden rule in the face of the current debate about migration? The philosopher Levinas has proposed an asymmetrical interpretation of the rule, whereby the recognition of the otherness of the face of the other already imposes upon me an obligation to hospitality. Paul Ricoeur counters that Levinas goes too far, but Ricoeur still underscores the element of difference in the encounter with the other. What we encounter when we encounter someone whom we deem to be foreign is not just a translated version of our own self. Rather, it's an occasion to learn more about ourselves by virtue of what we do not yet understand about the other or about ourselves. The golden rule, Ricoeur argues, goes beyond simply placing oneself in the shoes of the other. It's the basis of an ethics of responsibility that begins with the appreciation of the foreignness of the foreigner. This country is clearly a country of immigrants. The political debates are not going to be resolved simply by acknowledging that we all have an immigrant past, if that means that the narratives of immigration are assimilated into a single Americanist paradigm. Love of neighbor remains still a powerful and powerfully universal principle for addressing the present concerns. Laws need to be formulated, and violators of laws need to be rightfully prosecuted in this view, but only if there is a recognition that even those without documents deserve the respect of being considered a neighbor, as one who enriches the community precisely by virtue of being different from the majority of the population. Communities can legitimately debate about whether to grant such a person a driver's license, but exclusion on the basis of not belonging to the community would not therefore be considered a controlling argument in such a debate. In this view, the rule of law would not be undermined, only a limited Americanist interpretation of it. A second pertinent dimension of the natural law is the right to emigrate. The natural right to emigrate has defenders in the Catholic Church ranging from Pius XII to Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles. In non-theological terms, what is the content of this argument, and how does it apply to the contemporary debate? By calling the right to be a migrant natural, the Catholic tradition refers to a right that is universal and inalienable. Gender, race, and creed should not play a role in the restrictions placed on migration. The Catechism states, the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his own country of origin. Public authorities, says the Catechism, should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. End of quote. The argument in favor of a reform of the present policy based upon natural rights has many corollaries, but none, in my opinion, could be as important as the protection of the family. If it is the case that all peoples have a natural right to migrate to support themselves and their families, then it would also be the case that one should avoid breaking up families, even in the absence of proper documentation of legal residency. Innocent children do not deserve to be victims of any immigration policy. We're talking about children who attend our Catholic schools and receive the highest academic awards in them. The issue here is not whether the state can intervene and deport a parent without papers, as was already happening to the tune of 3.1 million under the supposedly progressive Obama administration. The issue is rather the corporate effect of this act on the community. Are we purifying or wounding the body politic by permanently keeping children from growing up with their parents? Should people throughout the United States be better informed about what's happening with deportations in San Antonio, Texas, and what this means for the kind of society that we represent at this present moment in history? I hope that we can discuss these questions at length in the discussion that follows.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Soren, for that nice introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be on this beautiful campus on a maybe less than beautiful day, although I did spend 20 years in Omaha, Nebraska, so I'm kind of used to this. Okay, so my position in my presentation will be to argue that more restrictive immigration policies are consistent with Catholic social teaching. I want to make the case that more restrictive policies are consistent with Catholic social teaching. So to set the stage, in 2003, a joint statement by the United States and Mexican bishop allows that countries need to establish what the document calls reasonable limits to immigration. But they urge in that document what I call the maximally permissive outlook toward migration. So reasonable limits, maximum amount of immigration consistent with reasonable limits, I think, is the general teaching of the church in the post-Vatican II era. The Catechism of 1994 stipulates that we have an expansive obligation to accept immigrants. This is what the document says. The more prosperous nations are obligated to the extent that they are able, that's reasonable limits idea, to welcome the foreigner in search of security and the means of livelihood that he cannot find in his country of origin. So those are the, as I understand it, an outline of the magisterial position. Maximum welcome consistent with reasonable limits. And I want to present two lines of arguments in my presentation today. The first, I want to operate within the framework of this magisterial consensus on the topic, and I want to advance an assessment of what constitutes a reasonable limit to immigration, and to argue that this principle can justify putting a brake on the flow of legal and illegal immigration into a country. So my argument will be within the constraints of this statement, one can argue for a more restrictive policy. The second line, the second half of my presentation, will be more open-ended. And here I want to point out that there are tensions within the magisterial tradition. And this throws doubt on the cogency of the current consensus in favor of maximal immigration. So within the constraints, and then a kind of larger step back to look at what I see as some incoherences that need to be resolved. So, reasonable limits. The first argument I call the argument from the preferential option for the poor. We live in a very rich country. Therefore, it's tempting to think that we have many resources available to accommodate immigrants seeking better lives. But for all our wealth, we have a very large number of native-born population that suffers from poverty. The last decade saw rising rates of chronic underemployment. And our fellow citizens aren't just suffering from poverty. In some places, they lack security. In Chicago, more than 4,000 shootings happened in 2016. Poor education is another problem. Less than 50% of New York City public school students pass the annual competency tests required by the state of New York. Now, immigrants often come seeking regular employment and a living wage. This means that they compete with resident workers for jobs. They also require social services, which draw resources away from the resident poor, who are already underserved by our current social welfare systems. It would seem, therefore, that our basic duty of caring for the least advantaged in our own communities requires a keen sense of the need to limit immigration. As Charles Murray documents, I gather he's one of your controversial visitors, as Charles Murray documents, our society is coming apart. Real wages for the bottom 25% of society have collapsed over the last 2 generations. Meanwhile, wages for the top 10% have increased. The rich are functional and flourishing. The poor increasingly live in a distant world that is dysfunctional and stultifying. Under these circumstances, restricting immigration may reflect a considered judgment about how best to refocus our society on the needs of the poor among us. It's been sobering to me to hear some friends of mine say that the only solution to the growing underclass in America is for us to import more foreigners with good work ethic and good family values. In effect, they're saying, let's ditch the losers among us and get ourselves a new working class. So, the argument from preferential option for the poor. Second argument is the argument from solidarity. The magisterium properly emphasizes the universal dignity of every human person. Moreover, the church rightly sees its own mission as borderless. The church is a supernatural society that transcends ethnic and national boundaries. However, precisely because of our church's universal mission, bishops and other Christian leaders often misjudge the finite and natural reality of a political community, which is not universal. So Israel, the church is Israel, not the United States of America. And so the Sermon on the Mount applies to the Christian community and not to a political community, at least not certainly directly. And a functioning society requires social unity. This is especially true for democratic nations, which depend upon a high degree of civic friendship to undergird the bitter, sometimes bitter, give and take of political struggles for power. Now, immigrants can obviously make very important contributions to any national community. But as a matter of, I think, sociological fact, they rarely reinforce solidarity. On the contrary, newly arrived immigrants usually form their own communities, which is entirely understandable. But it also contributes to social fragmentation. Now, obviously, a large country like the United States can accommodate ethnic communities. That's not a question. But our capacity to do so is not unlimited. And I would add, moreover, that the capacities of smaller, more homogeneous countries, their capacities to maintain solidarity in light of large-scale immigration may be very limited indeed. So at root here, the limitation is not economic, but it's a social limitation. We hear a lot of rhetoric about racism and xenophobia, but it seems to me this can be cheap moralizing. Good political leadership requires prudent judgment. And sometimes that prudent judgment is about the limitations of solidarity, which are always concrete and cultural in nature. At a time in our country when we know quite well that we are riven by a kind of bitter red state, blue state divide, it may be wise to restrict immigration. If we become a dysfunctional oligarchy rather than a functional democracy, we undermine many of the reasons that immigrants want to come in the first place. So that's the argument from Solidarity for with the reasonable limits might be less than we imagine. So now I want to shift to what I see are the contradictions in the church's teachings, contradictions that I suggest to me an insufficiently developed social doctrine on the matter of immigration, and that this insufficient development makes many of the magisterial pronouncements less than stable and also less than persuasive. So the first has to do with what I call the imperative of development. The church has been outspoken about the need to support the development of poor societies. And this dovetails with criticism of imperialism and the West's domination of many parts of the world. And in both cases, the church wishes to see nations flourish to the best of their capacities. Gaudium et Spes speaks about this extensively. And the Catechism also speaks of the need to remove what it calls perverse mechanisms that impede development. And all this is quite right to my mind. But isn't a rich world system that encourages immigration a form of neo-imperialism? We are stripping countries of their resources. In this case, their human resources, the resources of human talent, initiative, and ingenuity. Now, it's telling that many proponents of a generous immigration policy speak about the great contribution immigrants make to the United States, which I don't deny. But if this is so, then presumably we're depriving their countries of origin of these contributions. Thus, the problem is especially acute, it seems to me, in the migration of well-educated residents from the poor world to the rich world. For this reason, attacking those who favor restricting immigration as anti-Catholic would seem to be one-sided at best and incoherent at worst. In fact, restricting immigration, even restricting the resettlement of refugees, may be the best way to promote the development of poorer countries. I mean, it could be that some Middle Eastern countries like Syria will never recover from the migration of people from their own country, at least not in many generations. Next, incoherence. It rests in what I call the imperative of national self-determination. In the face of the Soviet Union's domination of Central Europe after World War II, Pope Pius XII spoke of what he called the right to one's own culture and national character, end quote. And at the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution, endorsed the anti-colonial sentiments of many African and Asian countries. And it did so by identifying the need to support all peoples in their desire for the full development of their own cultures, rather than living, if you will, absorbed into some imperial culture. This is the other side, it seems to me, of the Church's strong stance against imperialism. And in this case, it's one that emphasizes the need for the preservation and development of national cultures. John Paul II was especially keen on this due to his experience of the role of Polish patriotism in sustaining a spirit of resistance to totalitarianism. And it gave him a vivid sense of the unique importance of a strong and unified national identity. Now, it seems to me we live in a time of a kind of metaphysical impoverishment. This means that we can't imagine a nation or a people as intrinsically valuable, and thus as something to weigh against the legitimate needs of those who wish to immigrate. At some point, large-scale immigration undermines the coherence and continuity of any society. And it's, I think, foolish to think otherwise. And the Church has been very aware of the threat that imperialism poses to the integrity of colonized countries. I don't think that church leaders have faced up to the fact of what mass immigration means to in the current 21st century. For it also poses a threat to cultural continuity and national identity. I think in the United States we're in a very advantageous position in this regard because of the nature of our country, but I think European countries that want to restrict immigration, in some cases drastically, I think the Church is simply being incoherent in its rejection of imperialism, because immigration without intent to assimilate is a kind of colonization. Final incoherence, and this has to do with the threat of globalism and global capitalism. Pope Francis has identified global capitalism and a global system organized around technological rationality as a spiritual threat, as well as a system that is often blind, in fact, almost always blind, to the needs of the poor. In my view, he's correct in this regard. But I would submit that it is strong national cultures that are the only plausible source of resistance to this global system and the global technocracy. It's only strong national cultures that can offer resistance, and a political system that's robust enough and coherent and unified enough to meet this challenge. Fragmented peoples, or for that matter, migrating peoples, are vulnerable to domination and exploitation by the global system. It strikes me as not coincidental that Wall Street Journal columnist Bret Stephens is a tireless apologist for globalism. He argues for an ever greater freedom for the global flow of capital, goods, and labor. All three, right? So a borderless world for capital, a borderless world for trade, and a borderless world for labor. And again, I don't think that church leaders have faced up to the role that mass migration plays, as well as the rhetoric of multiculturalism plays in the neoliberal ideology that it is rejecting. Cultural deconsolidation, and the breaking down of national boundaries is a goal of liberal individualism, and it always has been. John Stuart Mill's idea of experiments in living requires the breaking down of cultural boundaries. And Milton Friedman's notions of economic freedom entail the breaking down of cultural and national boundaries. Advocates for restricting immigration are not necessarily xenophobic. They can be motivated by exactly the same worries about global capitalism that animate Pope Francis. So, summing up, I hope I've shown two things. First, the magisterium, as Peter Casarella mentioned, always qualifies its strongest statements on behalf of permissive immigration policies with an allowance for what it calls reasonable limits. This qualification allows wide scope for practical prudential judgments by political leaders about what best serves the common good. And also not only the common goods of one's own country, but the good of the countries from which immigrants come. It's entirely natural, therefore, and fitting that Catholics should debate immigration policy in the United States. It is false, however, to characterize arguments for reducing illegal immigration, or for that matter, also legal immigration, as somehow contrary to magisterial teaching. The good intentions and pious exhortations of bishops, or for that matter, popes, should influence our thinking, I believe, but only sober statements of principle should bind our consciences. And then second, the Catholic Church's social doctrine on immigration, as well as the theological significance of the nation, is not fully coherent, and I believe requires further development. I think one effect of the civilizational crisis from 1914 to 1945 was to encourage the West to reject any strong metaphysical meaning for nationhood, and that this has had the effect of actually distorting post-war Catholic understanding of the importance of nationhood and its relation to other moral questions having to do with leadership. In these circumstances, therefore, we need to find our way forward carefully. We cannot presume that Catholic principles speak clearly either for or against permissive or restrictive immigration policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusty, for that provocation. Couple comments. First, I agree completely, not just with Rusty's remarks, but also with the whole attention being paid to it by First Things, that things are coming apart. And the analysis of Murray is very sobering. And that's why I made mention of the fact that I don't find any recourse, any consolation in the secular versions of cosmopolitanism. But Rusty puzzled me in talking about the preferential option for the poor, something hinted at in 1968 at the General Conference of the Council of Latin American Bishops in Medellin, and then made more explicit when they met in the 70s in Puebla. And then of that, of course, John Paul II brought it into the magisterium of the church, talking about preferential love for the poor. We are talking about prudential judgments, and that was an important point that was made. But the prudential judgment I would make regarding preferential option for the poor and immigration policy is not that it decides everything one way or the other, but the disgruntled white working class that we now see much more clearly in light of the current political situation stands together with the undocumented Mexicans in our society. And I don't speak about this as a social analysis, which I'm not competent to give. I speak about this in terms of the work I do in this diocese, in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, where I have the privilege of teaching the Hispanic permanent deacons who work in the parishes here in the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. And they're very nervous about deportations, but they're working side by side with Anglo deacons, and they're working in parishes where there's white working class and undocumented Mexicans side by side. So I think the Catholic analysis, although there's prudential judgments to be made, to be sure, the Catholic analysis that would bring to bear on this situation is that the white working class, the disgruntled white working class and the undocumented Mexicans are together in the body of Christ. That's what I'm witnessing when people tell me what's going on in their parishes. Then a final comment about the third disjunction, whereby strong national cultures offer resistance. That's true, and I was glad that the point was brought up about how national cultures can work together against global capitalism and the spiritual threat that global capitalism can pose to us. The question then is, what is the narrative that brings about, in the context of the United States, a strong national culture? I think that we may have very different narratives there. So it's in that vein that I want to end with just a comment about patriotism. There's no homeland without virtue, nor is there real virtue when impiety reigns. These words were directed by the Cuban philosopher Felix Cerella in 1836 to the youth of Cuba. They were written in a book called Letters to Elpidio, just 1 year after the publication of the first volume of Democracy in America. Varela wrote them from New York City, where he had just been appointed Vicar General of the Archdiocese of New York. He was a refugee in the United States since 1824 because he advocated for Cuban independence and the end of the slave trade as a deputy in the Spanish courts. In New York City, he not only wrote to the youth of his native land, but he served and defended the recently arrived Irish Catholic immigrants who were there to work on the Erie Canal. You always have to bring that in Notre Dame. Cubans today still think of him as the one who taught us how to think. And he, of course, inspired Osvaldo Paya, whom I mentioned earlier, with his democratic reforms. So Varela was a patriot of his native country, but he also translated Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Democracy into Spanish. In confronting Protestant nativism and anti-Catholic prejudices, he wanted to help citizens in the United States to think about patriotism in terms that were Catholic, rooted in U.S. traditions of democracy, and inclusive of foreigners, migrants, and refugees. When he said that impiety got in the way of the proper exercise of virtue, he was speaking to the failure of a faith that deviated from the principles of hospitality that go beyond mere tolerance. He wanted to cultivate virtuous citizenship in a virtuous republic, and he knew that both virtue and citizenship can only be cultivated when one recognizes the most vulnerable in a society. Varela would affirm the words uttered by St. John Paul II in 87, when he said, at the time of the U.S. bicentennial, "You are thus a symbol in a kind of laboratory testing America's commitment to her founding moral principles and human values." Thinking about patriotism does not exclude thinking about the blessing of being a nation forged out of the dreams of diverse peoples. On the contrary, the urge to assimilation to a single, uniform, supposedly American culture must be resisted just on the basis of the founding principle of the dignity of every human person. The process of sharing a national identity can be affirmed together with the recognition of the blessing of diversity. This is not a secular call to multiculturalism. It's just good Catholic teaching. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. That was excellent. Let's open it up to questions from the audience. As always, we'll give preference to students, and stand up and tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Madison. So I have a question for you in your argument about the preferential option for the poor. Seeing as many of the poorest in the United States are undocumented immigrants, how do you reconcile your argument that we should focus inwards when many of those that are poorest in our own country are migrants themselves?
Rusty, let me repeat the question just so everyone can hear it and for the recording. So many of the poor, and maybe the poorest, are immigrants, or especially undocumented immigrants. If we're going to focus on a preferential option for the poor, shouldn't the focus be on that group in particular?
I don't see any reason why not. It's not inconsistent to be engaged in prison ministry out of your desire to, fulfill Jesus' command to visit the prisoner, clothe the naked, feed the hungry. And there's no inconsistency between engaging in prison ministry with a deep sense of service to those in prison and still think that we should have prisons. And it's not at all inconsistent for Catholics to be very, very engaged in ministries for illegal immigrants and still think that under some circumstances deportation is legitimate. Otherwise, if you thought that, when you could, well, anyway, I think that speaks for itself, yeah.
Another student question. Go ahead, Will, way in the back.
Wilson, Dr. Reno, I I understand like where you're coming from, I think, on immigration, let's say in Latin America, where immigrants might have a very bad life. But in places like Syria, where the question is like whether they'll have a life at all, how do you restrict immigration in that sense, where people's like lives and futures are threatened? Like the actual like war is tearing place apart.
I think the rich world has.
Russell, let me just repeat the question for the recording. So the question is about restrictions of immigration, especially from war-torn lands where people's lives, if they're not allowed to go somewhere, they may be in danger.
Oh, I think that the countries that have the means to provide protection and support for those refugees have a duty to do so, but that need not entail allowing them to immigrate to one's own country. It's possible to. Why wouldn't we could fund their relocation to other countries? But it's not. We're not obligated to. It seems to me that the imperative of care for refugees does not entail a right to immigration or a requirement to accept them as immigrants. It requires doing something to ensure that their security and their well-being.
Peter, do you want to get in on this one? And let me reframe the question, maybe directed towards you. You use the language of natural rights and the natural right to immigrate. Does that mean we have nations have an obligation to accept folks? Rusty seems to put things in matters of, really everything's a matter of reason, judgment, and prudence. But are you saying that those prudential judgments are outweighed? I mean, if someone has a natural right to immigrate, doesn't that impose a duty, a reciprocal duty to accept them?
I think that the point that's made in the Catholic social teaching is that persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their family. But you're quite right that that's different from a permanent obligation on the part of the accepting country. So that's where the prudential, obviously, I mean, you can't force, the Vatican can't force a country to adopt a certain policy. And that's why there's due attention paid in the teaching itself to the needs of each country. The question raised, though, points to an even deeper question about the relationship between those who are seeking a better way of life and refugees. And I think Pope Francis, with his trip to Lampedusa in general, has paid a lot of attention to refugees, and that's a very good thing. But then in Sweden, he has surprised a lot of his defenders because he brought up the distinction between refugees and those who aren't seeking asylum, and said, with regard to these kind of ghettos that are forming, where there's a lot of people who aren't seeking asylum, then Sweden obviously has a right to make their own prudential judgments. So it's not as if his focus on the refugee as a particular paradigm for understanding the migrant today. And I think there is an argument to be made in light of global situation that the refugee should be attended to more as one of the elements in a global migration, a global understanding of migration. But that doesn't preclude making the prudential judgment about how to treat general asylum seekers and the refugee in different ways.
Yeah, I haven't done the research on the natural right to migrate. It has a kind of surface incoherence to it, but I would not be at all surprised if it didn't develop primarily as a way of describing the fact that people have a natural right to leave their country of origin. So, if you're living in East Germany in 1950, you lived in a country that denied you a right to migrate. You are not permitted to leave. And so there's a kind of neo-feudalism there where the serf is not allowed to depart from the land, and that if they did so, they'd be arrested. And so I think that makes a great deal of moral sense, that no country can claim me and my loyalty, that I have a right to depart from it. But I find myself very perplexed by the notion that my right to depart from the United States that therefore translates into a natural right to go anywhere I want. That doesn't make any sense to me as from a moral perspective. And I'd be kind of interested I should do the research and find out whether it started primarily with the right to emigrate and turned into a right to immigrate.
Another student question? Okay, let's open it up. Let's open it up to everyone. Okay, Kate, way in the back.
Hi, I'm Kate, I'm a senior. I have a question about balancing the right to migrate and the right to one's own culture with also the possibility that certain migrants and immigrants may be coming into the country who hold certain values that are antithetical to those that have been established in our democracy, such as the right of, say, gay individuals or the right of women to be equal then. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
Okay, the question, as I understand, it's one about assimilation and assimilation of values. To what extent is there, or is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is there obligations on the immigrant in accepting the local values of the country that they are?
Well, the Catechism clearly states that immigrants have a duty to assimilate.
Well, I mean, you wouldn't, I don't see why any nation would not want people to take an oath of loyalty to the nation. I think we're agreed on that point. The difference has to do with assimilation versus, I mean, the melting pot is a myth. And what I find, what troubles me in some of the things I'm hearing Rusty saying is that there seems to be a very homogeneous understanding of belonging to the people of this land, of this country. And so I think that we need a narrative that promotes patriotism, that obviously upholds the law in terms of what constitutes citizenship, and that respects that. And that's why I was going back to a figure like Cerella, who was a migrant here and thought very seriously about the foundations of American democracy in terms of his service to Irish immigrants, and tried to forge a new discourse where it wasn't about assimilation, it was about adapting, contributing, participation in the democracy that was contributing to a sense of diversity in which we were still having palpable ways of being a people in this country.
I'm not sure we disagree on this, although I guess I would put it this way, that I think that I can imagine circumstances where, you know, if I had lived in, you know, the Czech Republic, I mean Czechoslovakia, the communist era, or in other situations where there were tremendous pressures of totalitarian pressures of conformity. But I don't think we live in this era. We live in an era where the we, the collective we, is more and more elusive. And so under these circumstances, I think we ought to seek to renew the collective we. When I was in my Episcopalian days, I repent of that now. In my Episcopalian days, I was a member of a church in Omaha that was a union of an all-black church with an all-white church, and one of the senior black members of the church wanted us to watch this movie, The Tuskegee Airmen. And he had grown up under Jim Crow, and afterwards he was very moved, and he said, how could we have done that to those men? We. And the power of the we, which was quite extraordinary moment of a kind of, if you will, solidarity, civic friendship. It didn't mean that everybody's the same, homogeneous, but I do think we cannot take that for granted. We cannot take the we for granted. And I believe that good political leadership in our era needs to seek the renewal of the we, the collective we, the pre-political we.
I'm going to follow up on this question. Is it reasonable for a nation to have ideological concerns, ideological tests as part of its immigration policy?
If the ideology is integral to the we, then yes. So in Germany, after World War II, West Germany, and I think that's the law of Germany, and Israel has the same law. It's a law of a right of return. So anyone of German ethnicity has a right to become a German citizen. And anybody of Jewish ancestry has a right to become a citizen of the state of Israel. And that doesn't mean you have to sign on to the Ten Commandments to become a citizen of the state of Israel. We have a different kind of country. And it's not based on those. But I think it's a kind of American arrogance to derogate that kind of we. We have a different kind of we, and our we is more ideological in a sense than, and it's you know, it's a we that has space for newcomers. In fact, we celebrate newcomers, immigrants, as part of our national myth. I think Peter used the country of immigrants, which is not true. We don't have a country of immigrants. We have a country of native-born people. The overwhelming supermajority of people in the United States are native-born. They are not and can never be immigrants to the United States by definition. But that just shows you how powerful that is in our mythology, and that we use that exaggeration to describe a we that is capacious in that sense. But it's not limitlessly capacious. And I would deny that it's multicultural, actually. I think we have a very monocultural society that's very powerful. It's thin, but very powerful, so powerful that it always takes the children away from the immigrant parents. And there's a whole literature from the middle of the 20th century of many by Jewish authors about the alienation of of children from their parents. Because the parents are from the old country, and the children, even though they're growing up in ethnic neighborhoods in New York, are Americans. And they feel acutely the distance between themselves and their parents. That's a sign not of a multicultural country, but of a country with a very powerful culture, one that the rest of the world both envies and resents.
Okay. In the back, and then we'll come up.
Philosophy PhD student. I wanted to ask about one of Reno's arguments for more restrictive immigration, in particular the one that we want basically the elites from poor countries to be able to work to better their own societies rather than just contributing to our society. So my question is whether this same kind of consideration would support not more liberal immigration, but more liberal travel policies in which people from poor countries can come to the United States for shorter periods, especially for things like education, so that they can get the skills that our higher education is able to teach and be exposed to American values, which we think are valuable, things like human rights and women's rights, and take those back to the countries they come from.
Okay, the question was about especially high-skilled or highly educated immigrants, and related to Dr. Reno's concern, what's commonly known as brain drain from countries. Does that have to be, can your concerns be alleviated by other policy options, especially allowances for travel, as opposed to maybe a barrier or restrictions?
Well, we currently place no restrictions on student visas, other than restrictions that flow from security concerns. So there's a limitless number of people that can come to the United States to do advanced degrees under our current system. So I don't see any concern there. On the brain drain thing, it's funny, one of the things about this last electoral cycle in the age of Trump is that the conversations about immigration I've had with people are much more frequent. It's very interesting. And I was sitting with a fellow, and he was making an argument that against my more restrictive views. Well, the hospitals in New York couldn't run without the doctors from India. And I said, listen to what you're saying. Do you think that people in New York City need, that our system depends upon doctors from India that are obviously not functioning as doctors in India? So it was a pretty, he admitted that I did have a little bit of an argument there.
Professor Philpott?
In one of your arguments, Rusty, for immigrants, you were talking about the threats of the white working class. You said, let's not...
Objection. I mentioned Murray, but I think that immigrants compete with people who are currently resident in the United States. And as you know, the American poor is not just white. It has many colors, right, and many backgrounds.
Okay.
So that's what I meant.
Okay.
I mean, the poor among us are the poor among us. I don't
Sure.
Categorize them ethnically.
Right. Well, my question still stands though, and I want to ask whether that kind of displacive zero-sum logic really is the case. I mean, one could argue that when new people come in, they actually form a new pool of labor that enables new industries to develop, which can in turn have a multiplier effect. Once they start making profits, they can hire more people and so forth. In fact, one of the ways in which a nation becomes prosperous is by having more people. And is this kind of displacive? Is it possible they could actually expand the pie rather than divide up the pie? And then second of all, many people economists have tracked that the United States is now starting to have a demographic, fertility replacement problem in the way that Western European countries are. And this also has a kind of economic drain kind of effect in many ways. Couldn't immigration actually help us to solve that? So both questions are revolve around the idea that immigration might actually help us economically rather than hurt us.
Yep, okay. I mean, that's an argument that's out there. It may be a true argument. People debate back and forth on this. That's why I didn't focus on that. Right? It's this, two economists, three opinions has been my experience. You have the
Could you both be right? I mean, it could expand the pie, but the extra pieces of the pie are going to go to the well-off as opposed to
one of an essay that really influenced me was by Christopher Caldwell in the Weekly Standard last spring called The Migrants of Calais. And he makes a very powerful observation that the two winners so let's say that we have more open borders, more fluid movement, and this will lead to greater wealth. A lot of people make that argument that the global economy, just because of the way of matching, production to labor, and there are all kinds of efficiencies by expanding, just like our country is richer for being larger, therefore we can make it global. But that in that system, it's the migrants and the rich who have a harmony of interest. They're both kind of winners in that, right? Because they have, if you're cleaning a rich person's house in Paris from Senegal, I mean, you've died and gone to heaven. And the smell of this fantastic spray to clean is the kind of smell of deliverance. And of course, if you're the rich person in Paris, you kind of like to have your house cleaned at much lower costs than it would be if you had to hire in a more constricted labor market. So it's perfectly possible that immigration could make our country richer overall. But the question is, to whom will those riches flow? Yes? So that's one of my concerns on that score. I mean, the Japanese have basically decided that they prefer their own sense of solidarity is deeply rooted in ethnic homogeneity, that they prefer that society, that kind of solidarity to whatever benefits immigration could bring. And I look at that and think, well, I mean, that's the Japanese, there are more important things in life than being rich. It's not the choice I make. I'm glad to live in a country that has a long tradition of not an entirely homogeneous, but a long tradition of having a pro-immigrant consensus.
Let's get Peter in on this, and then we should go to the demographic question as well.
Well, I just wanted to ask actually Rusty a question, because I was also tempted to try to trot out some of these economic studies that would show that, say, a more humane immigration policy whereby the undocumented, by paying proper penalties and so forth and going back and coming in, could be assimilated, and that would improve the economy. But not being an economist, I don't know what kind of debate we would have got into. It would have been amateurish on my part. However, the issue that I think we can address on the table without being economists is, if that was the case, that the economic situation would be either neutral or better, then it's primarily an argument about culture.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you just seem to concede the point that even if economically it were neutral or better, are you still saying you want to place restrictions on immigration? If so, then we have a legitimate debate about culture.
Yeah, of course. I think, again, if we can get richer and we lose the we, then I would say, well, we can't have a democratic society. Instead, what we'll have a kind of an imperial system dominated by oligarchs who who will then manipulate the segmented, fragmented society, you know, in ways to protect their own power. I mean, this is my point about the global system to challenge the global system requires consolidated political communities that are willing to act politically in order to secure non-economic goods.
Yes, but what I don't understand, I understand that point, and I'm with you on the general problems of secular ideas of cosmopolitanism that are attached to economic globalization. But where I don't see myself at all with you is on this cultural question, because if it was the case that 11 million undocumented, primarily Mexican workers could be then incorporated into the economy, which means saying they can be incorporated into society, I see possibilities for greater democratic participation, a much more thriving sense of the we. And I think I'm not hearing you acknowledging that as a possibility.
Oh, I'm perfectly, I mean, I'd be perfectly happy in a political debate and people say, well, look, the best way forward is some path to citizenship. You know, fine, let's, by all means, but I mean but the judgment then would be oriented towards how will this strengthen our collective solidarity, which is fine. I mean, reasonable people can disagree about how to best promote that, and that's all. That's all I really wanted to argue today, is that a more restrictive policy is a legitimate position to hold under the umbrella of Catholic social teaching. Not that it's the soundest policy. That's something that we could, you know, that's, you know, an ongoing debate. But what is the sound policy for promoting the best interests of the American Republic, both culturally and economically and materially? But I think that we often export like I say, our own optimism, which is often justified. I mean, if I was Dutch, I would, you know, it's pretty shocking for people to hold political rallies in your own country for elections that are happening elsewhere. I mean, that's unnerving. And you would begin to think, well, do we really have a country anymore? And I think it's very naive. It's a very naive American multiculturalism, which I think is it's one of the ways we complement ourselves, which I think is not based in fact, but we complement ourselves for this. It's very naive of us then to judge Europeans that want to restrict Muslim immigration solely because they fear that the future of their own civilization. I think it's a perfectly rational fear and a morally legitimate fear that they have. You know, whether the means that they use in order to, they can use obviously immoral means and also wildly imprudent means to meet that concern. But to have the concern at all, it strikes me as legitimate.
What about the demographic question and birth rates being beneath replacement rates, and how, in light of demographic difficulties, challenges that are predictable, how does that influence your thinking about immigration? I think that was the second part of Professor Flaubelt's question.
Look, I think that demographic declines stem from the nihilism of the West, right? If nothing is worth living for, then why would I want to, you know, do something for the future, sacrifice for the future with children? And that nihilism is reinforced by this sense that, well, we don't have a choice, you know? We just have to bring these people in, otherwise we'll never survive. And that seems to me to be, that's its own kind of hopelessness.
Why don't we try to get one more in? Yeah, please, Dominique.
Hi, I'm Dominique, I'm a sophomore. So, a couple months ago, I was looking through the requirements to get a U.S. green card. If you look through the list, a lot of them seem to be reasonable limits. You know, you can't have committed a serious crime in the country. And then if you look at the very bottom, it says we need to have a good moral character, and there's no definition for that. So do either of you think that this policy is problematic, especially considering the fact that U.S. foreign citizens aren't subject to this requirement in any way and aren't taught what it means to have a good moral character?
Okay, good. The question is on this is an application for a green card. There's a requirement that you affirm that you have a good moral character.
You don't affirm it. The person reviewing your
It's part of the evaluation. Part of the evaluation is an affirmation that the candidate has a good moral character. What do we think about that?
I'll
You know, I'm stuck with my children. So I can't really require anything of them for them to be my children. But if I'm going to invite someone to live in my house with my family, I can impose expectations on them. I have expectations for my children, don't get me wrong, but they're like I said, I'm kind of stuck with them. We're stuck with the people that in the Catechism of the Church, the treatment of the responsibilities of citizenship and the question of immigration is treated under the commandment to honor your mother and father. And that's the traditional way in which not just the classical thinkers and also Christian thinkers have thought about nations as a kind of form of family. And I think that this is helpful. When you do thought experiments about the morality of immigration, it's useful to sort of think, well, we should have a hospitable nation. I believe that and we should have hospitable homes. But there are significant limits to the hospitality that I'm willing to extend to others because of my duties to my children. Although we did have somebody live with us for 3 years, a Sudanese refugee, and so on, and I think it had a very positive effect on my children. And that's to your point, Peter. I do think that a certain kind of national hospitality can have a very positive effect on our national culture. But I had one refugee live with us, and he did have a good moral character. But some of my friends thought, like, whoa, how do you know? I mean, they were worried about all kinds of things about, what might go wrong. And and I didn't have 2, or 3. There are limits to what we could do as a family without compromising what I think are my more fundamental duties to my children. And I have duties to my fellow citizens that are greater than my duties to people who are in many ways worse off, but are not part of my national family.
So, if I had to choose between good moral character and bad moral character, I'd take good moral character. But you basically answered your own question. The question is not, I think, whether you can have that as a stipulation, but how you interpret it. And that's where these cultural and political questions that we've been discussing are so crucial, because whoever it is that's pushing the papers around is going to be listening to what's going on, if not getting discrete directives about what constitutes good moral character. So I just say 2 things with that in that respect. I did grow up in a household with a resident alien, someone who wasn't a citizen, namely my mother, because she married my father and therefore had residency, but never sought citizenship till about the time I went to college. So I was in a house with a resident alien growing up, and that influenced me in a way, because I began to think about. And when my mother embraced it, it was because she could no longer participate in politics in Latin America. She wanted to vote here, and it was a positive thing that drew her towards American citizenship. There was never a feud or a division. But that influenced me greatly in thinking about her Catholic faith and my Catholic faith. And I asked her once, what kind of Catholic was she? And she says she was a Catholic from the Andes. She's from Bogota, Colombia. And I started thinking about global Catholicism. And basically all the work I'm doing here at Notre Dame is now focused on that question, global Catholicism. So I think there's global Catholicism here in the United States. Catholicism is just one part of the American laboratory, American experiment. But the point I'd want to end with is just whether this experience that we all have in different ways of global Catholicism in the U.S. could be, in its own small measure, some kind of model for how we deal with migrants, how we deal with our sense of democracy, how we deal with this collective we.
Can I weigh in on that?
Please, yes.
I mean, universalism is an element of the American ethos, and often deeply influenced by the Christian element of the American ethos. But it's also one of the most dangerous parts of our national personality, this element of all-inclusive universalism. It is behind some of our more egregious adventures, military adventures globally, as we try to Americanize the entire world. So I would be cautious here. What seems like a very noble thing is, and it is in the church, of course, an integral part, and it's not at all dangerous in the church's global, in the church's universal mission. But that in a nation, we got to be real careful about our embrace of universalism.
Gentlemen, thank you. I mean, this was a perfect example of how Catholic social thinking and the Catholic intellectual tradition can help us think more deeply and think better about these difficult questions of public affairs, and also of how individuals of goodwill and friends can debate and disagree thoughtfully.
Peter Casarella has been wrong for a long time.
Please join
That's
me.
kind of true.
Please join me in thanking both our participants.
Way to go, Leslie. Good job. I agree. Thank you, Philip.